need to understand, and we'll also need to understand the components of the pharyngeal apparatus. Okay, so just a brief peek into the anatomy before we actually go into the detailed embryology of the pharynx. So the pharynx is a part of the head and neck region, and obviously it is a complex region of the body, but nevertheless, it is anatomically and physiologically well organized, and it serves numerous critical functions. And the critical functions, of course, includes providing a passage for air, providing a passage for food, and of course the production of sound as well. And why is it necessary to understand the embryological development of the pharynx and larynx and of the general head and neck region, the pharyngeal arches? Because you need to understand the etiological basis of defects, developmental defects that could affect this region. You probably learn, you may have probably learned in anatomy, and you will learn in future and probably in medicine. There are certain developmental defects that occur in this region, and a thorough and a basic fundamental understanding of the embryology of the head and neck region would actually give you a better sense of perspective in terms of diagnosis. Okay, and it also helps with understanding nerve supply and blood supply to various structures that are in and around the head and neck region. So basically, if you look at the pharynx, it can be described as a sort of a fibromuscular tube connecting the nasal and oral cavities to the larynx and the esophagus. Yeah. So it generally begins at the base of the skull, which is the area of the base sphenoid. So you see that? Can you see the pointer there? Yeah, that's a sphenoid bone, and that, you know, what you see above that is the sella turcica. Okay, so that is where the pharynx begins. Okay, and then it extends all the way downwards, and it ends at the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage, which is also similar at the level of the cervical, the sixth cervical vertebra. Okay, so it's got three major parts. The pharynx is divided into the nasopharynx, and then you have the oropharynx, and then finally you have the laryngopharynx as you go from superior to the inferior. Okay, so the nasopharynx is located between the base of the skull and the soft palate. So you can see that, you know, that's a soft palate. Hold on, let me just get the pointer. Yeah, okay. Are you all able to see the pointer there? Yeah. So this area is, yeah. So this area is called the nasopharynx, and it is continuous with the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity provides, you know, from the external nostrils or the nares. That's where you have the intake of air, and you know, so that, you know, the pharynx provides the passageway for the air into the larynx and through the larynx into our lungs. Okay. So mainly what you need to know is that the nasopharynx is lined by the respiratory epithelium, which is the ciliated pseudostratified columnar type of epithelium. That's why I've just put CPCE, so that, you know, it can just fit in there, along with goblet cells, which is secretory in nature. So you have mucus coming in, developing in the nose, basically because of these goblet cells and the pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Okay. The posterior superior part, which is this area, oops, sorry, hold on. Yeah, the posterior superior part there, okay, it has the adenoid tonsils. So that's the area where you have the tonsils. And the specialty about these tonsils is that they generally tend to physiologically enlarge between 3 to 8 years of age. And then generally it should regress in due course. But of course, sometimes it fails to regress, and it may become pathologic because of collection of, you know, bacteria, and, you know, it may become infective, and you may need to have it surgically removed. Okay. So that's the, you can see that from the lateral view, and you can see the structure of the nasopharynx from the posterior view. What you can see that it's generally a fibromuscular tube. Okay, you can see that with muscles and fibers. Then you come down to the oropharynx, which is the middle part of the pharynx that's located between the soft palate and the superior border of the epiglottis. Okay, so this contains the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Now remember, the tongue is actually, you can divide that into the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, which is in the oral cavity proper. And then you have the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, which is located or sited within the oropharynx. And along with that, you have the lingual tonsils, the palatine tonsils, and of course, you have the superior constrictor muscle, which is a fan-shaped muscle, which helps in bringing about constriction of the pharyngeal area. You also have what we call the Walde's ring, which is actually nothing but the pair of palatine tonsils along with the adenoids and the lingual tonsil, and they are referred to as the Walde's ring because that is sort of a line of defense against bacteria and foreign bodies. And the main function of the oropharynx is obviously it helps in voluntary and involuntary swallowing. So once you you chew the food in the mouth, and the various salivary enzymes act on it, and the food becomes a bolus, and then the act of voluntary swallowing propels the bolus down into the neck region, to the oropharynx, and then from there on you have the involuntary swallowing, which propels the bolus down to the esophagus. Okay, so the last part is called the laryngopharynx, which is the most distal part or the most inferior part that is located between the superior border of the epiglottis and the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage. And this continues inferiorly with the esophagus. The esophagus is obviously at the back, at the back, and in front you have the larynx. So the laryngopharynx contains the middle and inferior constrictor muscles. So you have those fan-shaped muscles, like I was talking about, the superior constrictor. So you have these, being enclosed by one another, which forms the middle and inferior constrictor muscles. Okay. Coming to the larynx, well, in contrast to the pharynx, the larynx, I would probably describe it as more a sort of a membranocartilaginous structure rather than the fibromuscular tube that you see in the pharynx. And this lies anterior to the pharynx and the esophagus. Okay. And the specialty of the larynx, obviously, it has got a number of cartilages because, it is, I told you, a membranocartilaginous structure. And these the cartilages actually enable, and the muscles present there enable us to help produce the sound, right? So so that's why it's often referred to as the voice box as well. So you have the functions of the larynx include the passage of air from the nasal cavity to the lungs, and of course channels the food from the mouth to the esophagus, because you have got the epiglottis here. Can you see the epiglottis? So that is the superior most part, which is sort of a leaf-like structure. If you see from the posterior end, posterior part, you can actually see this is a leaf-like structure which can open and close. Okay, so that when you swallow, at that point where the bolus actually comes in contact with the epiglottis actually closes to allow the bolus to be propelled into the esophagus rather than into the airway. Okay, and of course, like I told you, it's also known as the voice box because it helps in speech and phonation. Okay, so why is there a need to understand the development of the pharyngeal region? So in order to understand the development of the pharyngeal region, you need to have a thorough understanding of the head region as well, because the anatomic structures in the face and head are more diverse than any other region. What you need to understand that human development is a continuous process which spans from conception, that is, the formation of the zygote, up until birth, which is roughly about 270 days or about 56 weeks. Okay, so the human face developments basically begins in the 4th week of intrauterine life, wherein the external face is usually completed by the 6th week. Okay. And between the 6th and 8th week, you get the formation of the palate, which begins to form and again continues up until the 12th week of intrauterine life. And the pharyngeal arches, which are, which is what is important for, from our perspective of this lecture, it begins to form in the 4th week of intrauterine life. So you can see, if you look at this picture below, let me just magnify that a bit for you. Okay, so if you look at that picture here, now this is the head fold that you can see, and this area is actually the primitive mouth, or we refer to that as the stomodium. So the stomodium is actually bounded cranially by the head fold, and caudally, of course, you have the pericardial bulge. So this area, which is the future neck, that area that you have here, you will see is the site of what do you call development of certain mesodermal thickenings along the walls, so which we will come to in further slides, and these we refer to as the pharyngeal arches. Okay, so can I just confirm that you're all following what I'm trying to explain?
Yes.
Yes, doctor.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent, very good, fantastic. Okay, so I will just summarize in short, a summary of the embryonic development until the end of until the time that we have the pharyngeal arches developing from the area. So you have conception and zygote, and then on the 4th day you have the formation of the morula. And the morula, is a 16-cell structure, which is called the morula because it somewhat resembles a mulberry. Okay. And from the 5th to the 5th day, you have the formation of the blastocyst. Okay, so you know that as well. You probably already learned that in basic embryology. And on the 6th to 8th day, you have differentiation and implantation into the uterine wall. So what you need to remember is that what do you call conception actually takes place round about that area, which is called the ampulla. Okay, and then from there, the zygote actually traverses all the way right up to there, and gradually it will get, implanted into the uterine wall. Okay, and that's where, once it gets implanted into the uterine wall, that's where you have the development of the embryo. Okay, so on the 13th day, you have formation of what is called the procaudal plate. And the procaudal plate is what actually determines which end is going to form the cranial end, which is the head end, and which end is going to form the caudal end, okay, which is the tail end, or it's also known as the tail end of the bilaminar disc. So at the beginning of week 2, you refer to that as the bilaminar stage, wherein you have like 2 layers of cells. Okay, so this is also referred to as a week of 2s, because this you have what you call the embryoblast, and you have the trophoblast layer around it. Okay, and the embryoblast actually gives rise to 2 populations of cells, which is called the epiblast and the hypoblast. The trophoblast, which is around it, you can see that here. I think you can see that there. Now this one, the cells around it is referred to as a trophoblast. Okay, and that area is called the inner cell mass, or the embryoblast. Okay, now the embryoblast will give rise to 2 populations of cells, which is called the epiblast and the hypoblast. And the trophoblast, which is the outer layer, will actually give rise to the cytotrophoblast and the syncytiotrophoblast. Okay, and again, you will see that there are 2 cavities that are formed in addition to that one. This is the primitive yolk sac, and then you also have what we call the amniotic cavity. Okay, so that's why you call it the week of 2s, because everything is like there's a bilaminar this one, because the epiblast and the hypoblast, and then the trophoblast gives rise to 2 populations of cells, and you have 2 cavities. Is that very clear?
Yes.
Okay, so then you go on to the 3rd week, which is called the trilaminar stage. Now, what's so special about the trilaminar stage? Because that is the time when you have the formation of the primitive node, or this primitive node is also known as the Hensen's node. Okay, so it's sort of an area where you have very potent cells that give rise to all the 3 germ layers. So you will notice that the cells from the top, or the crestal area, will actually migrate downwards, and they will form the 3 germ layers. Okay, and remember that all 3 germ layers, the ectoderm, mesoderm, and the endoderm, are actually derived from the layer of the epiblast. okay? Because the epiblast basically migrates downwards to form the endoderm, which is formed first. Then you have the mesoderm forming second, and finally you have the epiblast layer converting to the ectoderm. Okay, so what do these what do you call germ layers give rise to? The ectoderm, obviously, the central nervous system, and the epidermis, and then you have the mesoderm, which gives rise to the cardiovascular system, the musculoskeletal, and the urogenital systems. And the endoderm, obviously, it lines the hollow cavities, especially of the gastrointestinal tract and of the respiratory tract. So do not forget that. It's very important. So the third to fourth week of intrauterine life, you have in the third week what your process called neurulation. So the gastrula basically moves on to become a neurula, or the process is called neurulation. Why? Because there is a formation of a neural plate. And how is this neural plate formed? Because you have the notochord, the underlying notochord, which actually gets the cells on the top to form the neural plate. Can you see in cross section? You can see that that's the notochord there. And so they actually stimulate an area of overlying cells to and this is referred to as a neural plate. And over time there are two what do you call they're raised. The edges are actually raised to form what we call the neural folds. Okay, and then if you look at the tip or the crest of this these folds, they form the neural crestal cells. And these neural crestal cells are very important because they give rise to many structures as well. Okay. Slowly over time, the neural folds will approximate and fuse together to form the neural tube, which is the precursor for the central nervous system. So that's, you can see that it's become a tube already. Okay. So of course, now you also need to remember that the mesoderm basically lines all areas except the area where you have the procaudal plate, because here you don't have mesoderm. And the procaudal plate, I mean, this is the area which is going to be known as the future stomodium. And the stomodium is actually separated from the foregut by a very thin membrane, which is referred to as a buccopharyngeal membrane. So you have another structure at the back over here, which is the future anus, and that is the cloacal membrane. Again, that consists only of endoderm and the ectoderm. All right, so these are the two areas where you have only these two germ layers. So everything's okay till now? Yeah, okay. Yeah. All right, so we go on to the next slide. Hold on, yeah. Okay, so we come on to the fourth week of intrauterine life. So you have the fusion of the neural tube, which starts in the middle, and it progresses cranially and caudally. And the last parts to fuse are the ends, the cranial end and the caudal end, which is why you must have heard of a condition called spina bifida, which is actually the bifid spine. So it's like, it's due to a problem with the fusion of the caudal end of the neural tube. Okay, so that's again a developmental defect which you'll probably learn later, or probably in general embryology. The anterior region of the neural tube forms the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And you have the hindbrain developing these 8 bulges called rhombomeres. So if you look at the structure here, so this is the notochord, the neural tube that we see here. You can see that, okay, the remnants of the notochord. Then you have the neural tube, which is the yellow structure in general. And just beside this, you have what we call the paraxial mesoderm. Can you see that? If you look at the cross section, can you see that? That's called a paraxial mesoderm, because that's a mesoderm, and the one that's just lying next to the neural tube, it's referred to as a paraxial mesoderm. And this one, this area is called the intermediate mesoderm, and lateral to it, you have the lateral plate mesoderm. Why? Because we have each of these will be involved in giving rise to various structures in the head and neck region. So basically, at this point of time in week 4, you have a folding of the embryo. So the embryo tends to fold in a craniocaudal plane as well as in a ventral, in the lateral plane. Okay, and why does this happen? Because the folding in the craniocaudal plane occurs due to the growth of the central nervous system, whereas a folding in the lateral plane occurs due to the growth of the somites, and the somites and the rhombomers are the precursors for the myotomes and muscles in that region. Okay, so by the end of the 4th week, because of the folding of the two planes, a part of the endoderm-lined yolk sac is brought into the embryo, and it creates the primitive gut. Yeah, and this consists of the foregut. You see that? It consists of the foregut, and it consists of the midgut and the hindgut. Okay, and you have at the cranial end, like I told you, the stomodium, which is the primitive oral cavity, and this is separated from the foregut by a membrane called the buccopharyngeal membrane, which only consists of the ectoderm and endoderm. And at the caudal end, you have what you call the proctodium, okay, and that's the cloacal membrane, and that's again, this membrane is again, it consists only of the ectoderm and the endoderm. Now, buccopharyngeal membrane, usually by the 28th day, you have a rupture of the buccopharyngeal membrane, and thereby the primitive oral cavity establishes direct communication with the foregut, and which sets about things in motion for the development of the pharyngeal arches. So those are the two views of a developing embryo during the 4th week. So you have this immediately after folding in the frontal plane. You can see that the head bulge, okay, this is just a diagrammatic representation, obviously. Okay, and then you have the pericardial bulge, and then you have the stomodium there, and then there's the umbilical opening, and you can, if you don't follow that, you can just look at the, the lateral view there. So you can compare the two, and then you can see how it would be. Okay, it's just a 3D image for you to better understand. Okay, so how do the pharyngeal arches form? Because these are actually a series of surface elevations or thickenings in the mesoderm along the lateral wall of the primitive pharynx, and it occurs caudal to the stomodium. So like I told you, that's the stomodium there. So caudal to the stomodium, you have these thickenings, okay, the surface elevations, but they arise because of the thickenings in the mesoderm, okay, and initially they are confined to either side of the lateral wall of the primitive pharynx, but they extend ventrally, and they will fuse with their counterparts from the opposite side to form arch or horseshoe shaped cylindrical bars. Okay, and these are very important because this is what supports the wall of the primitive pharynx, both in the lateral aspect and in the ventral aspect. So again, you have 6 arches developing initially. So you have 6 thickenings there. But in human beings, you will see that the 5th arch is small and it's rudimentary, or sometimes it doesn't develop at all. So at the end of it, you have only 5 arches. But if you number them, it would be arch 1, arch 2, arch 3, arch 4, and arch 6, because obviously the 5th one doesn't develop, or it involutes immediately during development. Okay, so you must remember that the pharyngeal arches are actually lined by ectoderm on the outside, and then you have endoderm on the inside. Okay, so you can see the picture there. It's easy to understand that. Okay, and these are coronal sections of the primitive pharynx before and after formation of the pharyngeal arches. So before the formation of the pharyngeal arches, you have the primitive pharyngeal wall there, lined on the outside by the ectoderm, on the inside by endoderm, and then you have the mesoderm, the greenish mesoderm in between, and you have the buccopharyngeal membrane, which actually separates the, the primitive oral cavity from the primitive pharynx, okay, or the primitive foregut. Okay, so after formation of the pharyngeal arches, you can see that you have arches 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. And again, these arches, obviously, they are lined, okay, by on the outside by ectoderm, and on the inside by endoderm. And then you have the ruptured buccopharyngeal membrane, because obviously the rupture is what, at the same time that you start developing the pharyngeal arches. Now, if you look at the structure here, you would have small like divots or depressions on the outside, which are referred to as the pharyngeal clefts or ectodermal clefts, because obviously it's in the ectoderm. And on the inside, the divots on the endoderm are referred to as the endodermal pouches. Some textbooks also refer to the clefts as grooves as well. So I don't want you to get confused, but nevertheless, it's better to know the terminology. So you have four clefts and four pouches, but you have 5 arches. Okay, so there should be no confusion regarding that, right? Now, if you look at the components of a typical pharyngeal arch, there is a major core of mesoderm, which you can see is the greenish structure. And this is derived from the paraxial mesoderm. Do you remember the paraxial mesoderm, which is the tissue that lies just lateral to the neural tube? Okay, and of course, there's the neural crest cells also contribute to the core of mesoderm. And within this, you will have the cartilaginous bar, which is derived from the neural crest mesenchyme. And this cartilaginous bar gives rise to various structures, which we will study as we progress further in the lecture. Okay, and then you have also a pharyngeal arch artery, which is derived from the corresponding horn of the aortic sac of the primitive heart. Okay, and of course, other than the blood supply, you need to have also the nerve of the arch, and this nerve is usually derived from the hindbrain vesicle or from the rhombomeres. Okay. So what you need to know also is that the arch mesoderm from the paraxial mesoderm, they form the muscles of the head and neck region. Okay, and the arch mesoderm from the neural crest cells, they give rise to the skeletal elements and the CT of the head and neck region. Okay, and what about the cartilaginous rod that is there present in each arch? That generally disappears except for the perichondrium or the sheath that persists and gives rise to various structures. We will discuss that in detail as we go on. And the nerve of the arch obviously provides both motor and sensory innervation to the skin and mucosa that's derived from, to the structures that are derived from the respective arches. Okay, and you also have arch arteries, which are connected ventrally to the arch of the aorta. Now, you need to understand that, okay, now these, I will just magnify that a little bit, because this is a concept, you need to understand. Now, each arch, you can see the first, second, and third arch here, and you have what we call a pre-traumatic nerve and a post-traumatic nerve. Now, the post-traumatic nerve of the first arch is obviously the mandibular arch, okay? Now, there is something what we call the pre-traumatic nerve, which is the cauda tympani branch of the facial nerve, which is actually the pre-traumatic branch. So if you look at the nerve supply to the tongue, if you can recollect, you will notice that the anterior 2/3 is obviously supplied by the lingual nerve, which is obviously a branch of the mandibular nerve. But the special sensations, like the gustatory sensation, the taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, is actually taken by the cauda tympani branch, which is a branch of the facial nerve. Okay, so generally each pharyngeal arch is supplied by 2 nerves, so one post-traumatic and one pre-traumatic. But the thing is, most often the pre-traumatic nerves will disappear from all arches except the first arch, where it will persist as the cauda tympani nerve. Okay, so that is something that you need to keep in mind. Yeah, so rest all other arches except for the first arch, the pre-traumatic component literally disappears. So taking a look at the derivatives of the pharyngeal arches, we have muscles that are derived from the first arch, and that is the muscles of mastication, the mylohyoid, anterior belly of digastric, tensor veli palatini or tensor veli palati, and the tensor tympani. So if you look at this, all these muscles are innervated by the branches of the mandibular nerve. Okay. Then you come on to the muscles of the second arch, which is the muscles of facial expression, the posterior belly of digastric, the stylohyoid, and stapedius. and they're all supplied by the branches of the facial nerve. Okay, and the muscles of the third arch, which is the stylopharyngeus, the lone muscle, which is supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, from the fourth arch, you have muscles such as the cricothyroid, the levator veli palatini, and the constrictors of the pharynx. So generally, these are supplied by the part of the pharyngeal plexus, or you can say the superior laryngeal nerve. And the muscles of the sixth arch, which is the intrinsic muscles of the larynx, and they are supplied by the recurrent laryngeal branch. Both of these, the superior laryngeal branch and the recurrent laryngeal branch, are branches of the vagus nerve. You must remember that. Okay, so you have that here now. I've just put that down for you. Just remember the nerve of the first arch. That's the only exception there, the pre-traumatic branch of the seventh cranial nerve, which is the chorda tympani branch, which supplies the gustatory sensation. Gustatory just refers to taste impulses. I mean, the sensation of taste. They're carried by the chorda tympani branch of the facial nerve. Okay, right. The second arch is facial nerve. Third is glossopharyngeal. Fourth is the vagus, which is the superior laryngeal branch, and the sixth is the recurrent laryngeal branch. Okay, so these are things. I mean, they could ask exceptions in the exam, so you must be prepared. Okay, so this is a diagrammatic representation of the nerves of the pharyngeal arches. You can see the first arch there, which is being supplied by the branch of the what do you call the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so you can see that that's a branch of the trigeminal nerve, and the second obviously is being supplied by the facial nerve. Okay, that's the second branch. Okay, the numbering is a bit skewed here. Okay, so but don't take that, because this is actually the maxillary process. Yeah, you remember that the first arch, which is the mandibular arch, gives rise to the maxillary process. So literally, this is the maxillary process which arises from the mandibular arch. Okay, so that is the second arch, which is supplied by the facial. And third, you have the glossopharyngeal. And fourth, you have the superior laryngeal. And then you have the vagus going down. And at the region of the carotid Sandevo, there's a nerve that comes back again. That's why it's referred to as a recurrent laryngeal nerve of the vagus. Okay. So those are the cartilages that you see here. So these are like horseshoe-shaped structures conforming to the shape of the arches after they fuse in the midline. Okay, so you can see the horseshoe-shaped structure here, but they have special names. For example, the first arch cartilage is often referred to as a Meckel's cartilage, and the second arch cartilage is referred to as the Reichert's cartilage. Okay, the third and the fourth and the sixth actually fuse together, and they're not given any specific names, but nevertheless they do provide for certain structures which we will see in as we progress. Okay, so that's the artery which supplies each arch. The first arch artery is referred to as a maxillary artery. Okay, the second arch artery is the hyoid and stapedial arteries. Third arch artery, you have the common carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. Fourth arch is the aortic arch on the left side and subclavian on the right. And the sixth arch, you have the ductus arteriosus, which again, if it persists after birth, it's called patent ductus arteriosus. So that's a developmental anomaly, a cardiac developmental anomaly, which you will learn. Yeah, and it also gives rise to the pulmonary artery, which is on the right side. So there's a difference between what you have on the left and on the right. Okay. Okay, so we come to the derivatives of the arch cartilages. So if you look at the first arch, I told you it's a Meckel's cartilage, which basically gives rise to the proximal end. You see the Meckel's cartilage extends from the midline over here. Can you see the, hold on, let me just get the, yeah. You can see that the Meckel's cartilage extends from the midline all the way dorsally up to the aortic capsule, which gives rise to the the ear, the primordium of the ear. So if you look at the Meckel's cartilage, generally it will disappear except for the most proximal end over here, which gives rise to the incus and the malleus. Okay, and along with the incus and malleus, you also have what you call the sphenomandibular ligament, which is formed by the perichondrial sheath. So what happens to the rest of the Meckel's cartilage? It basically disappears, but before it disappears, you will see that there is a mesenchymal condensation around the Meckel's cartilage, which will form the scaffolding for the formation of the mandible. Okay, so remember, the Meckel's cartilage does not directly contribute to the formation of the mandible, because no part of the cartilage is actually incorporated within the forming mandible. It only forms a scaffolding. Okay, but the part of the cartilage, it gives rise to the incus, malleus, the spinous-sphenoid, and the sphenomandibular ligament. Okay. Similarly, the Reichert's cartilage actually gives rise to the stapes, which is again in the middle ear. I mean, it's you have the incus, malleus, and stapes, which are the ossicles of the ear, as we refer them to as. And you have it also gives rise to the styloid process, the stylohyoid ligament, and the lesser cornu and the upper half of the body of hyoid bone. So the hyoid bone, as you know, can be divided into two parts, which is the lesser horn or the lesser cornu and the superior part of the hyoid bone. And then you have the greater cornu or the greater horn and the inferior half of the body of the hyoid bone. So remember that the second cartilage gives rise to the lesser cornu and the upper half of the body of hyoid bone as well. The third arch gives rise to the greater cornu and the lower half of the body of hyoid bone. And the fourth and sixth cartilages are very important because they are the ones that give rise, that gives rise to the thyroid cartilage, the cuneiform cartilage, the corniculate, arytenoid, and the cricoid cartilage. Okay. So those are basically the laryngeal cartilages and the thyroid cartilage. Okay, so that's a side view again of the derivatives of the arch cartilages. So it'd be good. So you can see that you can see that the mandible is developing around the Meckel's cartilage, okay, which is just lateral to it. But of course, that basically disappears. The Meckel's cartilage largely disappears except for the proximal end portion, which gives rise to the incus, malleus, spinous sphenoid, and the sphenomandibular ligament. Right. So I hope everyone's following till now. Everything is okay. Is it too overwhelming? Okay, so I have tried to make the slides as self-explanatory as possible. But nevertheless, if you do have any doubts, you're more than welcome to ask. Okay. Right, and then you have the derivatives of the pharyngeal pouches, which is, from the first pouch, you have what you call the pharyngotympanic tube. So if you look at the ectodermal clefts, so you have only the first cleft that contributes to the general mucosa of the the lining of the ear canal or the auditory canal, external canal. Okay, the rest of it basically does not contribute to anything of significance. Okay, so whereas the endoderm, which is the pouch part, the first pouch will give rise to the pharyngotympanic tube and the tympanic or the middle ear cavity. The second pouch will give rise to the tonsils, the palatine tonsil and the intratonsillar cleft. Now here, this is something that you need to keep in mind. The third and fourth pouches, the third pouch actually gives rise to the inferior parathyroid gland. So generally you will assume that the third pouch, because as it comes from superior to inferior, should give rise to the superior parathyroid gland. But due to, the development is designed in such a way that the third pouch actually contributes to the formation of the inferior parathyroid gland and the thymus gland. And the fourth pouch will contribute to the formation of the superior parathyroid gland. Okay. So that's a diagrammatic representation again here. So you can see that this is the ectodermal, the cleft as we call it, or ectodermal groove as we call it. So that gives rise to the primordium of the external auditory meatus, or the lining there. Okay. And generally what happens is the second arch, if you notice, it actually overgrows to cover the third and fourth arches. Can you see that? This is the third and the fourth arch, and the second arch actually overgrows them to cover them and to bury them. And this forms this. This is what we call referred to as a cervical sinus. Okay, so you can see that there. That's what happens. You can see the cervical sinus there. Okay, and on the inside you have the tubotympanic recess from the first pouch. Okay, the second pharyngeal pouch, which gives rise to the palatine tonsils, and the third one gives rise to the inferior parathyroids and the thymus, and the fourth pouch will give rise to the superior parathyroid and the ultimobranchial body, which is not really so important. Okay, so in order to understand the pharyngeal development, you also need to look at the development of the tongue, because a part of the pharynx is actually derived from the tongue as well. Okay, so if you look at the development of the tongue, usually you see that it develops at about the 4th week of intrauterine life. So this is actually, you're looking at the ventral wall. So let's say you have the embryo, and let me take a look. Yeah, okay, okay. Let's say, for example, I just have a cross section running through like that. Okay, do you understand? Let's say I have a cross section running like that, and I'm going to be looking at this part. That is the distal part, not the proximal part. Okay, so what I'm going to show you next is this area. Okay, so the wall is going to be opened so that you can see what you see here. Okay, so this is what you see there. You see that? Okay, so the cross section has been taken down, taken that way, and you have the embryo proper on the other side. So this is actually the ventral aspect. Okay, so on the ventral wall, you see these two lingual swellings along with a swelling called the tuberculum impar, all of which arise from the first arch. Okay, and these are the ones, the fusion, they will slowly enlarge, fuse together, and they are what, this is what gives rise to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, or which is referred to as the oral part of the tongue. Okay, and this is what we refer to as the hypobranchial eminence, or the other name is called the copula of His. Okay, it is derived primarily from the third arch, but with contribution from the second and the fourth arch. Okay, the intrinsic muscles of the tongue, they arise from what we call the occipital myotomes, which is why it's supplied. The intrinsic muscles of the tongue are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve, because the occipital myotome innervation is the hypoglossal nerve. Okay, so you can see that this is the laryngeal orifice, which we will talk about further when we talk about the larynx. Okay, so I hope you have actually followed up till here. So this is the fourth arch. So as it develops further, you will see that the hypobranchial eminence actually divides into a cranial component and a caudal component. Okay, so you can see at the same time that this is being divided, subdivided, you will see that these lateral lingual swellings enlarge and they start to fuse. Okay, and the lateral and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, including the valid papillae, develop from the cranial part of the hypobranchial eminence. So this green area is what contributes to the formation of the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Okay, which is the sort of the pharyngeal part of the tongue. Okay, and sorry. Okay, so you can see there again a different view. So this is with the tongue almost complete. So like I told you, the lateral lingual swellings have now grown. Yeah, hold on. Yeah, the lateral lingual swellings have now grown and they have fused together in the midline. And this line of fusion is referred to as the median sulcus. Okay, you can see that the median sulcus is there, and the anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue also fuse together. This is the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence. They fuse together to form what we call the sulcus terminalis. And this portion, this area is referred to as the foramen cecum, which is very important because it is from the foramen cecum which persists that you have the development of the thyroid gland. Okay, so if you look at this lateral view here, you can see that you can see the derivatives of each pharyngeal arch. So now that's the first pharyngeal arch, which is the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. But if you look at the second pharyngeal arch, it gets buried, or the third pharyngeal arch actually overgrows the second pharyngeal arch, which is why this one is supplied by, this area is supplied by the chorda tympani branch. So you have literally the fungiform papillae, which is innervated by the chorda tympani branch, which is responsible for conducting taste sensations, okay? And this area, of course, is supplied by the ninth cranial nerve or the glossopharyngeal nerve. Now, what happens to the caudal part of the, see, there's a caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence, and that contributes to the formation of what we call the epiglottis, okay? So the epiglottis is very important. You can see that there, because that is what helps channel the food into the esophagus and the air into the larynx and trachea and bronchi. Okay, right. So taking a look at the development of the thyroid gland, it begins to develop during the third week of intrauterine life. So you see it's basically from the endodermal thickening that occurs in the region of the foramen cecum, okay? And it develops as an endodermal thickening on the floor of the primitive pharynx between the tuberculum impar and the copula of His, which is the hypobranchial eminence. And then you have a depression which is called the thyroglossal duct. You see that? Slowly the endodermal thickening deepens, and it forms what we call the thyroglossal duct, which grows downwards and forwards and descends in front of the neck. Okay. Now, as it descends and reaches its final phase, final point, it will actually form a bifid tip, and then it forms the two lobes of the thyroid, which is later connected by the isthmus. Okay. And then you also, later on, the connecting duct, which is the thyroglossal duct, it atrophies, but the foramen cecum remains on the surface of the tongue. But occasionally it does happen that the thyroglossal duct may remain and it may form sort of a cystic cavity. So you have what you call a thyroglossal duct cyst, okay, in children. So it needs to be operated on and removed, okay? So this is just again describing the pathway of the thyroglossal duct in the neck. So the duct grows downwards and forwards. If you look at this line, you'll be able to see that. You see that? From the foramen cecum, you have the thyroglossal duct that grows downwards and slightly forwards and descends up to the level of the hyoid bone. So here it is in front of the hyoid bone, but in this region, it literally winds around the lower border of the hyoid, and then it attains a retrohyoid position. So from the front, it winds like that at the inferior border, and it becomes retrohyoid. And then from this position, it again descends below the hyoid bone with a slight inclination, mostly towards the left side. And then it goes on until it reaches this area where it becomes bifid. And there is actually, the cells actually multiply, and it becomes the lobes of the thyroid gland, which is connected in the middle by the isthmus. Okay, so the parafollicular cells, or the C cells, which are responsible for the secretion of calcitonin, are formed from the neural crest cells of the caudal pharyngeal complex. You remember the caudal pharyngeal complex, or the if you look at that, that's the caudopharyngeal complex here. See that? The caudopharyngeal complex from the fourth pouch. Okay, so that's what forms the C cells, or the parafollicular cells. Okay, so I hope you've been able to follow that. So now we go on to the development of the larynx, which is, we're almost reaching the end. Okay, so the larynx again is, is in the respiratory system and is endodermal in origin, and it develops from a median diverticulum of the foregut. So if you look at this picture here, can you see that this is an outgrowth that you see here from the foregut? Okay, so this endodermal outgrowth is referred to as the respiratory diverticulum, and it appears in the midline as a groove, and this groove is called the laryngotracheal groove. Okay, so if you look at the laryngotracheal groove, I will just, yeah, that's a laryngeal orifice there. So it's just next to it, yeah, the laryngotracheal groove. Okay, so the groove deepens then to form the laryngotracheal diverticulum. And the distal part of the diverticulum is separated from the esophagus by a tracheoesophageal septum. Okay, so there is a septum that actually separates the esophagus and the trachea. So you can actually see in the next slide, I'll come to that. Okay, so you can see that the cranial part continues to communicate with the pharynx. The cranial part of the larynx will continue to communicate with the pharynx, and this is called the laryngeal inlet. And remember that all the lining epithelia of the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs are derived from the endoderm. Okay. So again, in a little bit into looking at different views, which will make it more clear, you can see that the larynx again, it develops from the cranial most part of the laryngeotracheal diverticulum. So that's the laryngeotracheal diverticulum, and from the cranial part you have the development of the larynx. Okay, whereas the lower portion actually goes down and it forms the bronchi and other structures. Okay, and then you can see that, yeah. Okay, and then the posterior tube that you see here is the esophagus. So the mesenchyme of the fourth and the sixth arch surrounding the laryngeal orifice will proliferate, and this slit, you can see that that there is a slit that is over here that will become T-shaped. Okay, which you will see in the next slide, and the mesenchyme forms the thyroid, cricoid, and the arytenoid cartilages. So if you look at the changes in shape, so you have the laryngeal inlet here. Okay, that's it's a slit-like laryngeal inlet, and that is the epiglottis. Okay, and you can see that the arytenoid swelling developing on either side. Okay, and then the arytenoid swellings, as they become larger, this inlet it takes on the T shape rather than just being a slit. Okay, slit-like opening. So if you were to look into the adult laryngeal region, so you would see the opening something like that. Yeah, the characteristic adult shape of the laryngeal inlet. Okay, so remember that all cartilages of the larynx, they develop from the mesenchyme of the fourth and the sixth arch, and the only exception is the epiglottis, which is derived from the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence. Remember that the cranial part of the hypobranchial eminence gives rise to the pharyngeal portion of the tongue, or the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Okay, and the muscles of the larynx, they develop from the mesoderm of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arches. So I hope everything is quite clear. So I've tried to summarize, the whatever the derivatives are of the arches, the clefts, and the pouches. So as long as you are able to remember major portions and exceptions, I think you should be good. Okay. With that, I think we would come to the end. Okay.
Sorry, doctor. I want to
yes,
ask
please. Yeah.
about slide number 23, I think.
Hold on. Yeah. Let me just take a. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Yeah. Hold on. We just yeah. Slide number 23. Okay. Hold
on. Can you? Yeah. Sorry.
Which one is it?
It's nerves of the pharyngeal arches.
Okay, nerves of the pharyngeal arches. Okay, yeah. Okay, nerves of the pharyngeal. Yes, yes.
I kind of don't get what you mean by the exception again. Can if you don't mind, can you repeat the explanation for that?
Exception. No, the exception was not here. Exception was the pre-traumatic and the post-traumatic arch. Yeah. So this one, if you look at each arch, okay. So generally, morphologically, when the pharyngeal arches develop, there is actually two components. There is something called a pre-traumatic arch, which is the main arch of each, arch, right? And there is the post-traumatic arch. Okay. So what happens is the post-traumatic arch, which is the of the first arch, is the mandibular nerve, which is the most important. Okay. Right, which is the fifth cranial nerve. But the pre-traumatic branch is actually obtained from the facial nerve. You see that there's a branch from the facial nerve, which actually innervates the inferior portion, or the caudal portion of the first pharyngeal arch. So you have a similar nerve supply for the next second arch as well, which is the pretraumatic branch from the glossopharyngeal branch. But except for the first arch, the pretraumatic branch literally for all the other branches or all the other arches, they virtually disappear. They're of no significance except for the first arch, which will persist as the chorda tympani nerve, which supplies the or which takes the sensation of taste from the from the tongue, the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. All right. So that's the importance of the post-traumatic and the pre-traumatic nerves. Okay. So generally, when you refer to the nerve supply, you only refer to the post-traumatic branch. I have just tried to make it a little bit more detailed because this is in fact what really goes on. You have the pre-traumatic and the post-traumatic branch, but only the post-traumatic branch of each arch will persist. The pre-traumatic branch only to the first arch will remain, which is the chorda tympani branch of the seventh cranial nerve, and in all other arches you have it is of no significance. It really doesn't remain there anymore. Okay, so they've just end up with the one main post-traumatic nerve for each arch. The second one will be the seventh nerve. The third one will be the glossopharyngeal. The fourth one will be the superior laryngeal branch of the 10th nerve. And the sixth one is going to be the sixth one is supplied by the recurrent laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve. Okay. Is that quite clear now? Is that what you were referring to, or is there something else?
No,
yeah, that's what you were referring to. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I just need to remember that single exception and the exception becomes significant only in case of the tongue, because that's where you have the taste or the sensation, the gustatory sensations from the fungiform papillae on the surface of the tongue, because they're responsible for taking the taste sensations, through via the chorda tympani branch to the brain. Okay. Whereas if you look at the general sensations of taste for the anterior two-third, is going to be via the lingual nerve, which is a branch again of the mandibular nerve, which is a division again of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, is that quite clear? Yeah.
Thank you, doctor.
Any? Yeah. Okay. Right. So I really hope that you would look into because I try to make all these slides in a way that it's sort of self-explanatory. So if you would just probably refer to it even before your exams, I would think it sort of serves as a ready reckoner so that you won't forget. But the most important thing is always remember the exceptions to the rule are generally the ones that come for the exam, especially in terms of MCQs, SAQs, like that. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Right. So I hope everything is quite clear for the rest of you. Hello, is everybody? Yeah. Okay. So thank you once again to everybody, especially Grace, for arranging this meeting. Unfortunately, I'm not so tech savvy, so really a big thank you to Grace for arranging everything for me, and wishing you all the best, because you have exams in November, I assume. So all the best once again. Stay safe. All right. Till we probably meet sometime next year. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you so much, doctor. Stay safe.
Thank you,
Have a good
doctor.
a great weekend. Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.